is there such a thing as a Buddhist Bible? That is a key group of Buddhist texts that perhaps we all ought to read and understand and learn from. That's what I'm going to be discussing in today's video. Now, to be clear, there was a book written relatively recently, a few years ago, called The Buddhist Bible, which is basically an eclectic set of texts chosen by one particular person and put into a book form. I'm not going to be discussing that book today. I'm not even familiar with it. In other words, I don't have a copy of it. So that's not going to be the discussion in today's video. Instead, what I want to do is to look back at the texts in Buddhist history and come up with what we might call a kind of Buddhist Bible in the sense of a key group of Buddhist texts that we want to look at and might want to think about in sort of somewhat biblical terms, in the sense of we can think of there being something like an Old Testament of Buddhism and something like a New Testament of Buddhism. Some of these texts actually usually sit behind me on the window, the shelf back there on the windowsill, and they're not there now because I'll be sort of picking them up and showing them to you so you can get some idea of what those texts might be. So this is going to be a pretty large topic, so buckle up. We'll try to get to as much as we can. So in any event, there is no literal Buddhist Bible. However, there is what we might term a Pali canon, that is to say, a canon of texts in the Pali language. The language of Pali is an Indic language that is perhaps the closest that we have to a language the Buddha might actually have spoken. And there is, as I say, a canon of texts in that language. This canon also has translations of similar texts in other languages. These are called recensions, other recensions of the same texts. In particular, there is a very complete recension of these texts in Chinese and various fragmentary recensions of the same texts in Sanskrit, in other Indic languages, and a semi-complete group of them in Tibetan. Not as many as in Chinese, but there's a number in Tibetan as well. Now, these texts collectively, that is the texts in Pali, Chinese, and other recensions, this group of texts, it was what we might term the canon of early Buddhism. What we might consider the Old Testament of Buddhism. Now, this is not a great analogy. I perfectly am willing to agree with you on that, so we don't want to push this analogy too far, but at least gives us a general idea that there was this early group of Buddhist texts that describes a practice and belief of early Buddhism. Now, the question in all of this is there's going to be questions about what we might term authenticity, the authenticity of these texts, which are authentically Buddhist and so on and so forth, which authentically go back to the Buddha and so forth. I'm really not going to touch on that. I'll get on a little bit in a minute, but in general in this video I really want to leave that kind of question more or less aside. So in any event, although I've said that this Old Testament really should be understood to include material from different languages, it's easiest to sort of begin just by talking about the Pali canon in particular. It just makes discussion simpler. So in the Pali canon we have what's called the Tipitaka, the three baskets of the Pali canon. Those are the suttas, the Vinaya, and the Abhidhamma. The suttas are the dialogues that the Buddha had with various people, as well as dialogues between other people, which are considered important, canonical in the early texts. Then we have the Vinaya, which is basically the monastic rule book. And then we have the Abhidhamma, which is basically the formalized philosophy that we might call structured around ideas from early Buddhism. Now, as to the historical development of these three baskets, the suttas are generally understood to have come first. The Buddha himself is said to have lived, it's a matter of debate, but sometime around 480 to 400 BCE. The suttas, however, were not written down, not committed to any kind of writing, until, again, it's generally believed sometime around the 1st century before the Common Era. So quite a number of years, centuries, between when they would have been, say, originated and when they were written down. However, there are intermediate periods, in particular, some what are called the pillars of Ashoka, the great Buddhist monarch, that do mention a few of these Buddhist texts sometime around 150 years after the Buddha's lifetime, which would have been, I think, within the period of time at which some people would have at least remembered people who knew the Buddha. The suttas are, as I say, considered generally the oldest material and really the most central for most of our understanding of belief and practice of the what we might term the Old Testament or early Buddhism. There are 5 collections, or what are known as nikayas, collections of early texts. Each one is organized in a somewhat different fashion. The first of these is we might term the long discourses of the Buddha, the Digha Nikaya, a very, very famous collection of, as you might expect, longer discourses. I'm not going to get into all of what's in all these texts. That would just take way too long, but I'll just mention a couple. One of them, the Brahmajala Sutta, is the first sutta in this collection, which discusses a large number of false views. Views, let's say, of nirvana that are not correct. People may have gotten into deep states of meditative absorption of one kind, may have mistaken that state for a state of enlightenment or nirvana, and so the Buddha is at pains to discuss why all these different viewpoints are wrong, and they're on a number of different topics, but in any event, important. Another very, very important sutta in this collection is the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, that is the sutta that discusses the last days of the Buddha, last months, really, of the Buddha's lifetime, in some detail, where he went, what he discussed, his last discussions with his close attendant Ananda, which are quite important, his last words with his Sangha, his death, and then some occurrences that happened after his death that are, again, important for the early development of Buddhism, including the sort of first council. Second, there's the Majjhima Nikaya, or middle-length discourses. This is, we could argue about this, but this is probably the most famous book of discourses among all of them. It's the book that Bhikkhu Bodhi, the scholar who actually did the translation of this book, and has written a lot about early Buddhism and so on, when he gave his course, his audio course about sort of introduction to the Dharma, he began with suttas exclusively from this book, because they sort of encompass a very, very broad range of topics. Once again, there's no way I can get into anywhere near all of this. I'll just mention a couple of famous suttas here. One being the Satipatthana Sutta. There's a version of this also in the Digha Nikaya that I just mentioned. Satipatthana Sutta is the sutta on the 4 foundations of mindfulness, which basically is, we might call the earliest description of meditation in the world, really. The earliest complete description of sort of how we do meditation, how we structure our practice of meditation. There is also a discussion of mindfulness of mindfulness of breathing in particular as well. And there's another sutta called the Alagadupama Sutta, or the Sutta on the water snake, which contains a vast number of important dharmic points in it. It's perhaps most famous for the simile of the raft, where the Buddha compares the Dharma to a raft, which we're supposed to make use of in order to cross the river of samsara to the farther shore of nirvana. But we're not supposed to cling to this raft or identify with it. It's rather a raft, that is, the Dharma is a raft for us to use for a particular purpose. Again, not to cling to, not to identify with. A very, very important teaching. Third, there is the Samyutta Nikaya, or connected discourses of the Buddha. This is a number of suttas that are organized in terms of themes. The last 2 we discussed were organized in terms of the length of discourse, long and then medium. These are, again, in terms of certain kinds of themes, topics in the suttas. Some people believe this, some scholars believe this to be the earliest collection. Hard to say for sure, but anyway, that's what some believe. It contains a number of very, very important suttas, In particular, some of the first 3 suttas that the Buddha actually gave, the first 3 discourses that he gave to his first 5 disciples, or at least the first 2 were the first 5 disciples. The first discourse being the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, or the Sutta on the rolling forth of the wheel of the Dharma, where the Buddha first discusses the Four Noble Truths and so on. The second discourse is the Anattalakkhana Sutta, or the Sutta on the mark of non-self, where he first originates this concept of non-self and discusses how we can come to understand non-self through the fact that we don't have complete control over basically anything. And the third of his first discourses is the famous fire sermon, where he discusses the depth and importance of dukkha, or suffering, in our lives, by talking about how all things are sort of burning with these fires of dukkha, of craving, and so on. The fourth collection of suttas is the Anguttara Nikaya, known as the Numerical Discourses, and you won't be surprised to hear that this collection is organized in terms of number. So we begin with the discourses about one kind of thing, then discourses about 2 kinds of things, and 3 kinds of things, and so on. Some scholars believe this collection to be relatively late, for what it's worth. As with the first 3, this collection also contains a great number of important and interesting suttas. I'll only mention one of them right now, which is one of my favorites. The Discourse to the Kalamas is in this collection. That is a discourse where the Buddha basically outlines we might call the sort of fundamentals of Buddhist epistemology, that is, how we know about the world. The Buddha is discussing the Dharma with a bunch of people who are confused, who don't know what to believe. They've had lots of holy people go through their village a number of times, each one saying a different thing, and they're in a position of basically not knowing what is true, what to believe. In other words, how do they tell who knows what they're talking about? And what the Buddha very famously says is that you should not go upon, you should not believe somebody based on tradition. You should not believe somebody based upon the fact that they might be a good speaker, that the fact that they might be famous, the fact that they might be your teacher. But rather you should take what they claim and test it for yourself, basically. That's what the Buddha says. So it's a very famous and I think wise and important sutta. Finally, there is a 5th collection of discourses known as the Khuddaka Nikaya, or Minor Discourses. This is kind of a miscellaneous grab bag of different books of one kind or another. Some of them, such as the Dhammapada, are very early. We also have collections like the Sutta Nipata, which some of the suttas in the Sutta Nipata are very, very early indeed. Others of the suttas in the Sutta Nipata probably come later. We also have the poems of the Buddhist monks, the Therigatha. We have the poems of the early Buddhist nuns, the Therigatha. We have the Udana and Itivuttaka. All of these are considered to be relatively early, arguably about as early as the suttas we've already been discussing. Also, however, in the Khuddaka Nikaya are various relatively later texts. In particular, there is commentarial material, like the Nidesa, that is, commentaries on early texts, which themselves obviously must be later because they're commenting on the early material. There's also sort of hagiographical material about the Buddha, sort of stories of the Buddha's life, the Buddha Vangsa, Charya Pitaka. There's the Milinda Panyaha, that is the questions of King Milinda, which must be quite a bit later because the questions of King Milinda come after the invasion of Alexander into North India and that area, and the installation of Hellenic society in North India, and King Milinda was a Hellenic king, and so that's clearly going to be centuries after the Buddha's lifetime. So we can see there's a broad range of material in this last basket, this Khuddaka Nikaya, this last, I should say, collection of material. Now, as I say, this sutta material, all this material I've been discussing, at least the earlier portions of it, constitute what I believe to be the heart of what we should be interested in if we are interested in study and, that is to say, the Dharma study and practice of early Buddhism, of this kind of Old Testament Buddhism, if you like. Now, where do you find this material? As the books I've just been holding up, at least the first four, at least part of the first four suttas, there are translations by Bhikkhu Bodhi. Also, the longer discourses are translated by Maurice Walsh. They're all out in Wisdom. Wisdom Publications publishes them. I can leave links to those books down below in the notes. But they're also available online in a couple of different places. There's an online translation at Access to Insight, which is done by Thanissaro Bhikkhu. And there's also translations done at Access to Insight, at Sutta Central by Bhikkhu Sujato. And these are different translations. Bhikkhu Thanissaro's translations tend to be a little bit idiosyncratic. So I would not go to those as your first stop, but rather I would prefer going to Bhikkhu Sujato's translations that are somewhat less idiosyncratic. Also, Bhikkhu Sujato has been updating his translations over time, which is helpful. Of course, these are free translations in both of these online examples, so that's a good thing. As for the other recensions I mentioned at the beginning there, the recensions, the similar texts in Chinese or in Sanskrit, Tibetan, whatever, it's harder to find translations of those texts. They're not as widely available, and many of them are not available at all. Again, at Sutta Central, they are, in my understanding, intending to come out with, over time, translations of all these recensions. However, at the moment, I don't think there's very much there in material that's not Pali. There's some, but not a lot. I would expect and anticipate that over time that will grow. Now, one of the questions that people have, as I mentioned earlier, is what happens when you have a text which only exists, say, in the Pali and doesn't have a recension in any other language that we know of? Does that mean, therefore, that this text is a later interpolation, that it was not, let's say, an early Buddhist text at all? And the only response I can give to that is that that's a matter of scholarship. It is true that texts that only exist in one recension, or it is one possibility that they were indeed created at a later date, that they were not in the other recensions because they didn't exist when the translations were made, and that these texts came later. But it also may be that texts were left out for some reason. Perhaps a translator decided not to translate a particular text, let's say, into Chinese because they didn't feel, for some reason, that it was a good idea to translate that text. Perhaps it was saying something that they didn't feel was right, or right for that audience. Or it's possible that they forgot about a text. It just simply, their memorization was not perfect. They simply overlooked a group of texts. Or the texts were lost at some point, which certainly does happen. There may be times at which a group of texts is in a particular, written down in a particular folio, and perhaps at some point there was a narrowing of the texts that existed, and that folio was mislaid, and so it just never got propagated down the centuries. There's many different reasons why texts may not exist in other recensions. However, it is one way that we look at the potential earliness of particular texts. Now, as I mentioned, there are two other baskets of material in the Tripitaka, or the Tipitaka, of the Pali Canon, one being the Vinaya and one being the Abhidhamma. I'm not going to discuss these in any great detail, because, as I say, I think they're of secondary importance for most of our interest. However, the Vinaya is as I say, the monastic rule book. It's particularly important to people who want to become monastics to understand what those monastic rules are. There's quite a large number of them. And in addition to the rules, there are stories given with each rule as to how that rule came about, why it was propagated in the first place. These, in general, scholars believe these stories to have come somewhat later than the suttas, that is, they're potentially many from after the Buddha's lifetime. And although I will say that there are included some material from the suttas. In other words, there are some suttas that are basically word for word included in the Vinaya as well, because the same sutta story is relevant to the production of some rule or other. Last of these baskets is the Abhidhamma Pitaka, the Abhidhamma, which is this attempt to sort of collate and formalize the Dharma of early Buddhism that we find in the suttas in a form that is more easily digestible and understandable. These are sort of very, we might say, dry, sort of philosophical texts, lists, and so on. Traditionally, they're believed to have been taught by the Buddha either to the gods or to Sariputta, who then sort of disseminated them to the world. However, mention of this basket, the Abhidhamma, is not made in at least the Pali example of the first council. In other words, when the first council was made after the Buddha's death, they mention the suttas, they mention the Vinaya, they do not mention the Abhidhamma, which at least suggests to most scholars, I would say virtually all scholars, that the Abhidhamma is later, comes later, perhaps a century or more after the Buddha's lifetime. It comes, we might say, with a growing professionalization of the monastic community. You don't just have, we might call less professional, or we might term monastics who are more interested solely in practice, but rather monastics who are interested in knowing the Dharma for its own sake, and sort of learning the Dharma and learning how to teach the Dharma correctly, and perhaps coming up with various methods of teaching where they would boil the Dharma down into its basic points so that it could be taught more easily, and so that if you wanted to learn some particular point of Dharma, you wouldn't have to go through the equivalent of thousands of pages of memorized material, because again, all this stuff was memorized. You wouldn't have to go through this huge amount of memorized material in order to pick out the particular questions that you had answers to. Rather, the material was all sort of boiled down into a form that was more easily digestible, where we could look at a particular passage and say, okay, that's what the Buddha meant by such and so. But again, for most of our purposes, it's probably best simply to focus on the suttas, because there's plenty of material there. Okay, so if all of this constitutes the Buddhist Old Testament, what about what we might term the Buddhist New Testament? Well, I think that's where we come to description of what we might term the early Mahayana texts. The early Mahayana was involved in a truly revolutionary reinterpretation and reframing of the Dharma of early Buddhism into a new form. This happened some, let's say, 3 to 5 centuries, more or less, after the Buddha's lifetime. Now, it's important to stress that not all Mahayana texts are later than all texts in the Pali Canon. As I mentioned, there are some texts in the Pali Canon that are really quite late, such as the Questions of King Milinda, as I mentioned. And some Mahayana texts come quite early. So there definitely would have been a period of some overlap, but generally speaking, the texts in the Pali Canon, in particular the Sutta texts, are earlier. They are indeed what the Mahayana is responding to. It's what the Mahayana is trying to reframe into a new kind of form. So then, what would have been these texts we might include in this New Testament, this kind of Mahayana New Testament, if you like? I think there are probably too many to really enumerate easily, certainly in a video like this. Basically, the Mahayana arose with the arising of literacy. So these texts arose during a period where texts were written down. They were not simply memorized. As a result, there was a true explosion in texts, in things that were written, in sutras, in commentaries, in analysis, and so on. But probably the earliest, at least some of the earliest texts of this new Mahayana came in what were called the Prajna Paramita Sutras. the sutras on the perfection of wisdom that originated sometime around the 1st century before the Common Era and after that period. These are texts heavily involved with questions of emptiness, deep paradoxical questions about the self and so on, and what really exists and what doesn't. This is the beginnings of the Bodhisattva path, the idea of the Bodhisattva as being somebody different, a path different from the path of the Arahant, somebody who was not simply looking to become enlightened, to achieve nirvana and then end the round of rebirths, but rather someone who was looking to become a full Buddha. The Lotus Sutra is another key text from the early Mahayana, and perhaps around the 1st century of the Common Era, maybe a little bit before that, when it originated. It was the Lotus Sutra was probably compiled over a number of centuries, but in any event, it originated the idea of skillful means, which is something I touched on in a number of recent videos of mine that I'll leave links to down below in the notes. The general idea being that all of the material in early Buddhism, in the what we might term again the Old Testament, were basically just skillful means that the Buddha had to get across ideas to people who were of lesser abilities. But what the Buddha really meant was something quite different. That is to say, the Mahayana path, and the Lotus Sutra is there to sort of give us the origins of that Mahayana path, along with these, as I say, Prajnaparamita Sutras and a number of other material in early Mahayana Buddhism. Other early Mahayana Sutras were critical in developing this new idea of Buddha nature, that the nature of all things was the nature of the Buddha, that the Buddha was in a sense in all of us, that gave us our abilities to become Buddhas eventually. This would have originated with the 2nd century of the Common Era text, the Mahaparinirvana Sutra, which is different from the Mahaparinibbana Sutta that I mentioned earlier from the Digha Nikaya. This is a later text, again from the 2nd century of the Common Era, Mahayana text. Also in the 3rd century of the Common Era, Tathagatagarbha Sutra, that discusses again this kind of womb of the Tathagata, Tathagatagarbha, that's in all of us. Again, originating these ideas of Buddha nature in a way that they hadn't been discussed before this. We also have the Avatangsaka Sutra from somewhere around the 3rd century of the Common Era. There's some disagreement about that. But setting out the Buddha less as a person, less as a human being, and more as a kind of a universal principle that unites all things in a kind of an interpenetrating web of being that's known in that sutra as the Indra's net. So we get this very famous metaphor of Indra's net, this kind of universal net that encompasses all of the universe, all of reality. And at each of the nodes of the net is a little jewel that reflects all of the other nodes in the ways that, again, Buddha nature reflects all things, or the way that any individual consciousness is reflected in all of the other consciousnesses, so on and so forth. Many different ways of interpreting that metaphor. So again, something I did a video on a while back. I'll leave a link down below in the notes if you want to hear more about that. Another very, very famous text from this general period is the Heart Sutra. Many of you will probably know that text. It has a somewhat contested origin story. Some scholars believe that it actually originated in the Chinese and then was back translated into Sanskrit. Others believe that that's not the case, that it originated in Sanskrit. Probably comes from a somewhat later period, from maybe the 5th century or so of the Common Era, but very, very heavily influenced by the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras that we discussed earlier. In these schools of the Mahayana, we also encounter somewhat different Vinayas, that is to say monastic rule books. Monastic rule books are somewhat different from the Vinaya we find in the Pali, as well as, and importantly, as well as different Abhidharmas. That is to say, the Abhidharmas, there are some core elements of the Abhidharmas that seem to be held within all schools, a few. But there's a lot of separate development of Abhidharmas, which again leads scholars to believe that the growth and development of the Abhidharma came after the split into different schools, in Buddhism, and that therefore these Abhidharmas are basically sectarian documents intended to describe why their school is different and better than other schools, because they have this particular interpretation of the early sutta material. There are many, many other key texts, really key texts in Buddhism, but texts that perhaps shouldn't be considered part of the Buddhist Bible, but more like commentarial material of one kind or another. I do want to touch on some of these because they will be of interest to people who want to know, some of you, about, again, key Buddhist texts. Perhaps one of the most famous of these is Nagarjuna's Mula Madhyamaka Karika, or discussion on the middle way. This is, again, this is a good translation of it, at least that's what I've been led to believe. I'll, again, leave links to it down below in the notes in case you're interested. Nagarjuna basically wrote this text, people believe, in response to what he saw as overreach in the Abhidharma of his time. That is, the Abhidharmikas, the people coming up with the Abhidharma, had sort of gotten too close to their material and were making claims of it that Nagarjuna did not believe were justifiable. In particular, Nagarjuna wanted to re-emphasize this idea of emptiness, that all things, indeed, were empty of self-being, of own being, empty of substance. This was an idea that originated in early Buddhism, in the suttas, with the idea of non-self that we discussed earlier in the Buddha's second sermon. However, Nagarjuna takes this concept quite a bit farther and extends it quite a bit farther than you find typically in the early texts. This material then established what's known as the Madhyamaka school of Mahayana Buddhism, which is very influential down to the present day. There are other schools around at the time, such as the Yogacara school, that instead of looking at emptiness, rather looked at a non-dual consciousness as being particularly important. Again, a school with its own sutras, its own treatises, its own commentarial material, and other schools besides. So we're getting into an enormous amount of material here, in the northern school of Mahayana Buddhism. In the southern school of Theravada, we have a text with somewhat similar importance, that is Buddhaghosa's Visuddhimagga, and I have a copy of that here. Buddhaghosa's general attempt was, again, to do a kind of a systematic simplification of the Dharma into a digestible form, in particular simplification of the ethical matters of the Dharma, the path to purification. Visuddhimagga means the path to purification. Buddhaghosa was an expert on the commentarial material. Many people believe that he originated a lot of that commentarial material, or at least collated it from material passed down to him. And so he was sort of coming at the material from early Buddhism from the position of the commentators and trying to formulate this into an more easily digestible text. And this text has been extremely influential in Theravada Buddhism. In any event, there's way, way too much to get into here. I'm just giving you a very basic sort of surface look at some of this later material as Buddhism continued to become more and more professionalized, and the monastics became more and more kind of like academics. The material that they produced became more and more, we might say, scholastic, more and more hair-splitting in its points. And various people continued arguments against each other, arguments which you can learn about if you learn about some of this later material, that went on again for centuries, that in a sense continue to go on to the present day, about what is the proper interpretation of various hair-splitting kinds of Dharma points. I haven't discussed a lot of later material here, examples being the Vajrayana, the Tantric texts that stem from a later period, sort of early medieval Buddhism, texts from China and Japan, which were very, very important to the development of later schools of Buddhism, such as Zen or Pure Land Buddhism. Again, there's an enormous amount here. All this is to say that we've expanded here well beyond what we might consider a Buddhist Bible. What I wanted to discuss today is this idea of key Buddhist texts. Is there such a thing? Could we talk about such a thing as a Buddhist Bible? And what I've wanted to argue is that, in a sense, we can discuss a kind of an Old Testament, which is made up of material from particularly the Suttas of the Pali Canon, as well as other recensions of that similar material in other languages such as Chinese, early Indic languages, Tibetan, that has a small portion of this. That is kind of our early canons of early Buddhism, that is our Old Testament. Then we have this New Testament of early Mahayana texts that really attempt to do a revolutionary reinterpretation of that early material in the same way that the New Testament of the Bible is kind of a revolutionary reinterpretation of material in the Jewish Bible, or what's known as the Old Testament in Christianity. Again, the analogies are far from exact here, and I really don't want to claim that they are anything exact, but in any event, they give it a general flavor of this idea of what text we might want to be looking at. This later material becomes voluminous. It's impossible to get a great grasp upon all of it. So what I would recommend to you in your practice, in your study, is to focus on some particular aspect of it that interests you. Because if you try to grasp it all, I find it'll probably make you quite confused, because you have texts by a number of people in different schools of Buddhism, from different backgrounds, making different points, and maybe even points that they understand disagree with one another because they, again, come from different backgrounds. So, again, I would recommend that you focus on one particular aspect. For myself, I'm particularly interested in the Suttas of early Buddhism. Now, one question that we might have is the role of Pali, the language of Pali in all of this. Is it important? Is it necessary to know Pali? Is Pali somehow critical? And I did a video about that quite a while back, and I'll leave a link to it up here on the screen if you would like to see it or would like to refresh your memory. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look at my Patreon page, which is linked down below and up here on the screen, and see if you want to help support the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll catch you on the next video. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.